This is a recording of a recent event hosted by BUILD Shankill, inviting author of The Rape and Plunder, Ron Wiener, and local activist Jackie Redpath to reflect on the issues of the 1970s redevelopment of the Greater Shankill. It also provided an opportunity for current activists under the BUILD Shankill campaign to highlight some of the strategies and interventions that they have developed to respond to the physical regeneration of the Shankill today.
Thanks to Argyle for hosting us here. I want to thank really Artez, because again Artez is another partner that has evolved out of this ongoing work of looking at how we can lift the Shankill and regenerate it. And Arts is, as we know across the world, has been a vehicle to try and regenerate. So that's just one strategy we're using, and there's students who are currently here with us. But Artez, through the conversation with Ron, is the reason why Ron's here. Ron Wiener, you're all here to hear him. He's an author of a book that's very relevant to us, The Rape and Plunder of the Shankill. And I suppose it's set out at a very, very dark time. He's taking signings, by the way, £5 a signing. And if you have that book, and thankfully I have one, you're doing all right, because they're actually quite valuable now, so don't be giving it away. But Ron Wiener, as I say, was the author of this book. He's a man of many talents, by the way. And whilst we probably associate him with the Shankill, he's done lots of work in drama and theatre. That's why he was invited over with Artez here. He's going to be doing some work tomorrow with the students. And we could not miss the opportunity to have Ron reflect back on that dark time of our history in the Shankill, when basically the heart was almost ripped out of it. Jackie Redpath, you will all know, nobody needs an introduction. He was there as part of the Save the Shankill campaign, of which Ron, you'll hear a wee bit about that, handed over the baton. So Jackie's here to help us reflect back at them dark times and what actually communities did to draw in on ourselves in the mid-70s. The format is quite easy going. Hopefully, we're just going to have a conversation. I'm going to draw out a couple of questions. Ron's going to talk about his experience here. I'll ask Jackie to say a few words. There'll be some opportunities for questions. If you have a question, I'd ask you just to stick your hand up, because I think for the recording here, there's a wee mic. It'd be good to get the audio.
Well, it was interesting, because when I was here in the Shankill, whenever it was, in the 1970s, it felt like a small town. And when I came in from the airport last night and then went for a walk around Royal Avenue and things like that, it suddenly, Belfast suddenly seemed to be this huge city, which took hours to get around and to get from the airport. And when we were doing some of this stuff with Jackie and thinking about the Shankill and thinking about the history and thinking about the changes that had happened over the years, and one of the biggest changes was, if you like, the decline of the shipbuilding industry and the harbour and the docks and things, and the influx of modern capitalism, if you like, which came in and changed and basically changed everything. And so when I was walking around last night, that became really clear that, you know, and I was thinking, if I was somebody new coming in, whether I was a tourist, whether I was a property developer, whatever, how would I see the Shankill? Because it's kind of like a small working class area. How does it appear to other people? And I was thinking, what value, you know, what is it about the Shankill now, which is still important, both for people living in the Shankill, but also for the people outside? And if you were a property developer with £500,000 or something else like this, what would you invest in the Shankill? Okay, so those were some of the preliminary thoughts. But to start it with, because I would find it works best if we do a bit at the beginning which encourages everybody to talk. So what I'd like you to do is to turn to somebody else, preferably somebody you don't know, and I'd like you to come up with three things. Okay, I'd like you to think about the Shankill, in the past? What's one word which sums up the Shankill in the past?
Shops.
Yeah, that's a good start, right? Yeah, yeah, I remember this huge Ribbon Road shopping. Yeah, okay, but
Community spur.
okay, so we'll do it as a group thing then. Okay, no, that's fine.
You can't claim them, Ron.
No, I know, but that's really nice. Okay, so let's stay. And also, for people who haven't been on the Shankill a long time ago, what image do you have, or what image do you have of what it looked like? So it's not only people who lived. So if we're thinking about the Shankill in the past, what are the things that come up for people? Housing, pubs, family, community, poverty. Pardon? Sorry? Home, yeah. That was so important. It was, yeah, because a large part of it was the destruction of these old neighbourhood communities, and particularly one of the things around in it was the role for older people. So that because a lot of the community lived in the street, therefore older people had a role in helping to protect the street. And one of the things that happens with redevelopment is that role disappears for older people and you're shoved into care homes. And so you become isolated very often from the wider community. Okay, so if we think about, if that's something of the Shankill in the past, what is there about the Shankill in the present?
Bathrooms.
Yeah, bathrooms.
They're laughing at outside toilets nowadays. You think in the middle of the night?
Yeah, I remember growing up, not here, but I remember growing up with outside toilet. Fun? And toilet.
Belfast Telegraph.
Okay. Pardon? History. The past, yeah. Pardon? Murals. And that was really interesting, driving up and seeing the very different murals that there are now compared with the murals that there were in the 1970s. What else comes to mind if you think about the Shankill on the present?
Lack of housing, open green space.
Sorry, lack of
Lack of
housing,
open green space.
an open green space, yeah.
Plenty of cars on the Shankill now. There never cars. We used to play football in the streets because there was no cars.
Yeah, I remember, yeah.
Every 2 and 3 cars outside one house.
I think there's a good sense of resources and groups. You know, I think that's one thing that we have. The infrastructure for people, no matter, and people are facing many issues, but there's thankfully many services in the Shankill to try and help address them.
Right.
There's still poverty.
Yeah. What was interesting, Rowan took me around some of the, where's Rowan? Oh, right, okay. Would you like just, what was the area we went round?
You know, Longbrook Avenue, where it's been socially affordable housing was built. We had a look at it, and it's really nice. There's 3 or 4 rows there, and there's been other developments like that. So there's been positives here. I mean, I think community spirit for me is still a tremendous sense of community spirit, despite everything that's happened here. It's a very strong sense of community spirit.
We're seeing Laurel Park seem to be part of the Shankill. Sometimes we don't feel, have never felt part of the Shankill. I'm frustrated with the lack of regeneration.
Right.
Growing up in the, give me age away, but I was born in the 60s, and the area's been raped, as you say. You called it raped.
Yeah.
And I see, well, there is changes, but they're far too slow.
Right.
And I think the BUILD project should have happened 20 years ago. So,
Yeah, I mean, because some of the houses that we saw where Rowan took me around were some of the things that we would have liked back in the 1970s, whereas the Weetabix blocks, as they were called at the time, and all about the motorway, and then all the series of negotiations that you had. And what was interesting back in the 1970s, you actually, for a brief period of time, had an armed working class on the Shankill, and that actually enabled, and that actually equalised to some extent some of the negotiations that you could have with the powers that existed in terms of housing. Okay. And if we think about the future, just for the moment, what words would you like associated with the Shankill if you're thinking 10 years ahead? What would you like to see in the 2030s? What would you like the Shankill to be like? Repopulated.
More peaceful.
More peaceful.
Well, I would like to see this community preserved. Basically, I would like to see this community still to exist,
Right.
so that, well, some of the plans of the good and the great to transform working class areas in Belfast and further afield in Northern Ireland into so-called shared space, which is just a cover name for gentrification and, well, basically destroying, and undermining the local community spirit, including the national and religious identity of the local community as well. I would like to see the communities preserved on both sides of the sectarian divide, if you like. I would just like, because, well, all those issues affect. Well, I suppose, well, we're talking about the Shankill, and well, I did much of my research in the lower Shankill in particular, which was probably the worst affected by what I would call the encroachment of town, or the encroachment, of the so-called, shared space. Well, the areas, on the opposite side of the sectarian divide, like Carrick Hill and the market, they face the same problem. There's no housing, being built there, while private developers or hotels or offices or whatever, try to move in. So, well, that's personally, I would like to see this community.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
Last question. I would like to see the reduction of drugs in the communities. You have physical structures, you can't have that without people.
Yeah.
The people are our community, and we have reduction in drugs. It's never going to go away, let's be realistic, but the fact is we need more services for our young people around mental health. We're in crisis here, and also hopefully the reduction of suicide. So we need to look after the people as well as building up our communities.
But before we do that, folks, we're going to have a wee conversation with Ron and Jackie about the 70s, about why Ron came here, how he got involved, what was it he's seen, and he's already touched on that. And we're not going to dwell on the past, because again, whilst we're proud of our past, and some of it was very difficult past, it is about what we want for the future and what we're doing now. And all these things will challenge every generation, no matter where you live in any working class area. So the first part is about looking back with Jackie and Ron here. And then Ron is going to take on the interview, and myself and Ian McLaughlin are going to talk about the current, a wee bit more recent, about what has happened in the area. And we know, folks, that this is a huge problem. We know that Jackie has been doing it for 50 plus years, and there's still a lot of work to be done, and it's still an ongoing work, because things come down river that we don't foresee or we have no control about. But the fact that we have, I was thinking there, Jackie, I like history, and the Shankill used to be called the Road to Antrim. And I was just thinking, I thought, it's really ironic that actually what the developers planned is that the Shankill would no longer have had a name of the Shankill. It probably would have just been simply the Road to Antrim, because that's all it was going to become, until people in the Save a Shankill campaign stepped in and says, no, we're going to protect the identity, and we want to do something about the life and experience of our people that live in this community. I'll just finish it there, but again, a wee video that I suppose highlights the conditions. I remember the term Gusty Spence used when someone said to him, did the Protestant working class with the privilege? And he says, you might have got a slum slightly quicker than the Catholic. And I think that video highlights there was absolute poverty. There was a need to change these slums. But again, and we'll start to talk about this, it has to be with people. These people, the The Shankill very much was developed, as we know, in the industrialisation, and really the needs of the houses weren't for the people. They were for the mill owners. They were built for their need, not the people that lived in them. And I think that's always. And then when it came along about developing, and Jackie will know this more than anyone, communities weren't consulted about what it was they want. They were told what they would get. And I think it's really ironic that the so-called experts told people what was right for them and what was best for them. And actually everything that the community did and said as part of that campaign, and we'll hear about now, actually came true. It was the community that had it right, not the perceived experts that flew in or come in and told us what we should have. And I think that's something that really we need to realise. This community has the sophistication to address it, because of the fact that it's still here, and if you looked at it on paper and what it's went through, it shouldn't exist. It should be just maybe the road to Antrim, but it's not. It's still a proud community. And it proves that when people get together, people know what they need and people know what we want. We don't need experts to tell us what we want. We can develop it ourselves. It's a long, hard struggle, and we've proven it all the time. So that wee video to me just highlighted the type of stuff, Ron. You come in, Jackie, you want to come over here again and we'll get a wee chat? Tell us one thing, Ron. You came from the north of England. What possessed you to come in 1970 to probably one of the most ravaged, violent places in Western Europe and help?
I think it's about how far you go back. Okay. I was born in England, brought up in Australia. And when I was brought up in Australia in the 1950s and in 1950s, Australia was an incredibly sort of racist, sexist, homophobic country at the time to grow up in, and Aborigines were actually seen as right at the bottom. And a few years later, I got a job working in Holland to go out to Australia, and they were doing preschool education, and I got quite a lot of time spending time with the Aboriginal community, and it was being able to see the world from the other side. And that was part of, I think, my awareness of always being more concerned with the people at the bottom rather than the people at the top. And I came over back to England, went to university, and got involved in doing some in an organisation called conflict resolution. And so rather than just being an academic, it was about deciding it would be more useful to go and do something about it.
What type of stuff did you do? How did you get your teeth into what you were doing?
I think primarily the main issue at that time was housing. So that was the time when very much the picture that you actually saw there, that was people's living conditions. And so, and there were numerous community bodies, but very much as you were saying, it was Belfast Council, whatever, telling people what they were going to get. And so what I saw part of it was actually being able to say, there are other ways of doing this. You don't have to accept these houses. And particularly, they were going to build the elevated Belfast urban motorway, and then you've got these terrible Weetabix housing they were going to put at the bottom to soundproof them. And that was kind of interesting with talking to the paramilitaries at that time, because the first thing they wanted to know was, would an elevated motorway give us a military advantage? It was quite serious. And you had to sort of have that discussion before you could talk about the benefits and the ills of having, the destruction to the community that would actually happen if you actually had this motorway driving through. And all across the countries, motorways always go, urban motorways always go through poor working class areas. They're always exactly the cheapest land. You say the middle, the middle classes get the benefit from them, the working classes suffer from the effects of them. So part of the campaign then began to say, how do we actually organise a resistance to what was coming, and then, but it was no good only negotiating on the plans you were given, because if you were only negotiating on the plans that you were given, you were making minor adjustments to somebody else's plan, so that what you wanted was to be able to say, we can do something entirely different, which ties in with what you actually want. And so that's why we tied in with Queen's University Planning Department architect Professor Cliff Morton at the time, who could come, and they were willing to use their expertise and use the students to help design alternative plans. And of course I had a great advantage because I've got a PhD, which is in psychology, nothing to do with medicine, but I could phone up the housing executive and say, I'm very worried about so-and-so's health. This is Dr. Wiener talking. They immediately thought I was a medical doctor talking about somebody's health, and they say, oh, very good, well.
Yeah. So Jackie, I mean, my understanding is that Ron was there from 73 or 71, 73, and then you come in, there was a bit of an overlap where he sort of had started off things and then you picked it up. Tell us about I know that you've talked many times about the fact of the bulldozer doing more damage than any sort of terrorist bomb here, and had ripped the heart out of the community. And I think this whole depopulation, 76,025, how does a community start to begin to rebuild when they're facing that?
One thing, because it's a nice bulldozer story. Well, we were up with, I was up with some residents at Stormont at the time, and we were talking about redevelopment, and the government minister, or whoever it was, said, well, we're going to, whatever you say, we're going to send the bulldozers in on Monday. And the guy sitting next to me said, and we'll shoot the first bulldozer driver we see. So that actually, that actually changed your ability to be able to do some negotiations.
Well, thankfully we unfortunately can't rely on that sort of tactic, which is a good thing at the minute. So we just have to be smarter, I suppose. So Jackie, you picked it up. You got involved as a young man, the Shankill, living there, seeing what was going on. What was the first sort of things that you had to do then when you had sort of seen what Ron had picked up as his research?
I was brought up in Shankill Baptist Church, which was like the Taliban of the Baptist churches, never mind, whatever. It was pretty extreme sort of place. Probably still, I better say nothing, but whenever I sort of discovered that they changed their gospel meeting on a Sunday night, which was meant to save souls, it was the chance for people to come in to get saved, that because of the riots, they changed it to 4 o'clock in the afternoon so as they could get the cars out before the riots started at night. I sort of thought, this isn't really what it's supposed to be about. And I remember asking for the use of the church hall, I was 19, 18, I was very religious at the time, to bring the kids in. It was like, you'd call it peer work now, I didn't know anything about that, and peer youth work and all, to bring them in, and got refused. The elders of the church said no, because they might put cigarettes out on the floor or something. And we opened a wee community house down in Haddo Street, which was down at the bottom of Bellevue Street and Sugarfield Street. And it was called The Way, and then became the Jesus Liberation Front. And
pretty radical then.
We used to go, when the riots were happening, in to give. There was a guy called Arthur Blessed used to come about with a cross from Los Angeles on wheels and come up and down. And he with Jesus stickers we used to give people in the middle of the riots and all. So anyway, when I left all that, because the kids that became like converted in this wee house then started separating themselves off, and it was the other ones that were sort of more interesting, because they were going around when the redevelopment was on, taking the doors off houses not with people in them before they were bricked up, and making window boxes and all. And I thought this is interesting. So I realised that a lot of that there was mayhem going on around us. And I think that's one of the important things to remember. As Ron says, it was 50 years ago. So I was just thinking this morning when I wakened up, and I wasn't quite at it, and still not quite at it, but, 50 years ago was 1972. So if we were here now in 1972, which doesn't, to be honest with you, seem all that long ago to me. I know you said you were born in the 60s, so you would have a wee memory of it, and other people would. But if you were sitting here having this conversation in 1972, about 50 years before that, it would have been 1922. Now, it seems to Billy and me like yesterday, 1972. In fact, you were a good, mature man then, Billy, but I don't know what happened to you in the meantime.
Am I getting paid for it?
But, we're looking back 50 years ago, and now looking back like that film, you wonder how you came through it at all. I mean, how this community survived, and I think that's number one thing. We have survived. We're still here. As somebody else said, we haven't gone away, And, it's a remarkable story, I think, from that point of view. The massive thing that Ron did, because I got a job, and I applied, where I was going with was I applied for jobs here, and I didn't get them. And I tried for a job as a youth worker in the YMCA in the Shankill and got more or less shunted out the door. And then this job came up in the Shankill Community Council, and it was the first community work job in a community organisation then that it had a funny title called Secretary Organiser. But anyway, I got that job, and that's how I came into contact with Ron, because redevelopment, by then it was 1974, I think, redevelopment was at its peak. The Troubles were at their peak. Where people worked were going into sharp decline, people being made redundant from the shipyard, Mackey's going down, all this sort of thing was happening. You just you couldn't exaggerate the upheaval that there was in all aspects of people's lives. They were losing their houses, they were not able to get other ones, there was violence in the street, it was just normal. There was bulldozers bulldozing, not just whole streets, but whole areas on this side of the Shankill, from Townsend Street up to Canmore Street, which was redevelopment area 12 and 13. You were given a number, you were you were in phase one, or as people used to call it, phrase one. And if you were in phrase one, you were all right, because you were likely to get a house, when within some sort of view of the future. If you were in phrase 8, which there was 8 phases, you were in trouble, because everything was still getting knocked down. On this side of the road, there was 4,000 houses demolished in that period of time between 73 and 77. And the only houses that were built on this side of the road in that same 4 years as 4,000 were demolished was behind the leisure centre at Percy Street. Was 140 houses in those, Whiten Street, Percy Street and all. So people had no choice but to go. And they had nowhere to go except outside of, some up to Glencairn and Spring Martin. But the vast bulk of people moved to the outer north, as you would call it, from Rathcoole out towards Carrick, Sunnyland, right up into Ballyduff and New Mossley, etc. So it was massive change that was happening. What Ron did, and what I inherited when I got that wee job, was what he brought into play was brains. That's the first thing. And I found that very useful. And he also wrote things down, which was unusual. And, there was stuff he did that interpreted what the planners were wanting to do at different levels, that became passed around the community, that put it in ordinary language that people could understand. And he was also helping to organise things, because at that point you had local redevelopment groups. So down in Percy Street, you had the Percy Street Redevelopment Association, and Sam Todd was there, and Mina Wardle, although Wardle wouldn't have been her name, Mina Good, might remember, was then called. And then on the other side of the road in the Hammer, because by that stage the very bottom of the road, Christopher Street and all, was gone, and the Weetabix flats were built. You had the Hammer Redevelopment Association, and you had Annie Morrison, and you had Sally Cummings, who's still alive. in there. And so you had these redevelopment groups that Ron was working with, and I inherited that from Ron, and we crossed over for about 9 months probably. And I remember we did this exhibition on the front of the road. Yeah. Ron did photographs, as well as writing, he did photos, and we put them up on these boards, got chairs, there's photos of this actually, got chairs out of the Salisbury and the Rex bar then, and put these against the road, against the chairs, leaning against them. That's how you did an exhibition then. On the front of the road on a Saturday afternoon. If there's any, it was the FA Cup final day, and Newcastle were playing Liverpool, and I think Liverpool won 4-1 or something. But there was, but then on the road on a Saturday, like you couldn't move with numbers of people. So that was a point of handover. And here's my abiding memory. He talked about being up at Stormont. I never made it that far in those days with people, but I went with Ron. My introduction to this with the planners was going with Ron and a woman called Claire Curry, who was a community worker in the YMCA in the Shankill. And the three of us went over to where Equality House is now at Shaftesbury Square, which was then part of the Belfast planning offices. And we met the housing executive planners, and one of them was called Harding MacDonald, you might remember. He actually lived up in Lyndhurst. My whole experience of those planners were the worst ones that had some sort of connection to the area because they thought they knew what should be done. And at that stage, at that meeting, they had 9 blocks of flats, 4-storey blocks of flats planned behind the leisure centre. That's where Percy Street, Wigan Street and all is now. There was to be 9 4-storey blocks of flats. And we went into the meeting to say, look, this isn't on. You need terraced housing in there. And basically what Harding MacDonald said, look, he said, you see when the Shankill was built 100 years ago, the people come in from the country, they weren't used to what they got in the houses then, living in streets like that. They'll get used to what I'm building. And there was no negotiation. That was it. And I left that meeting. Ron was leaving to go back to England. And I thought, I will never, ever meet these people again if there's not some muscle behind us in meeting them. And that's how actually the Save the Shankill campaign was formed, because it brought together all those that had anything to do in the community, from redevelopment groups to church leaders to women's groups to all the Shankill Road traders had an association then, and then the paramilitary organisations. And they all had representatives on the Save the Shankill campaign. And what Ron talks about, muscle, whenever you said, you know, and I remember the first protest march, we all walked down the Shankill to Townsend Street and drew on the gable wall of what was in the housing executive building on the corner of Townsend Street, no demolition beyond this point. When you actually put that up, it meant there was no more demolition beyond that point until people were going to negotiate with you.
But what we do know, because again, the Save the Shankill campaign was able to get information out, that waste redevelopment and this great plan that was going to help us get rid of slums came before the Troubles. It seemed that once the Troubles took a grip, that the priorities for some of the people in power was not necessarily about getting appropriate housing, but how to manage it in a security situation. And actually they encouraged that policy then, and there's many, Jackie, that believe that it wasn't a conspiracy, that there's evidence that actually the housing strategy for the Shankill was being directed by Hollywood and military barracks in Hollywood to break up the Shankill, because in the mid-70s there was upsurge of violence and murders, and people sort of within the echelons of power were saying, if we get rid of these people, maybe we'll get rid of the problem. Tell us, Jackie, how did you get that sort of, I mean, there's no freedom of information access then, there's no technology, you're doing everything with who you have around you. How did you get those sort of information, and how did you challenge those dark forces that didn't have the interests of these people or this community at heart?
Okay, I'm going to ask Ron to say something first because I don't believe that's how redevelopment started. Right? Ron mentioned modern capitalism in his introduction, and he'll maybe talk because in one of the benefits of the Rape and Plunder of the Shankill, that book, is the analysis it gives as to why redevelopment was happening, and it's important to understand that. It became something else, or became part of something else a bit later, which I'll talk about. But I think Ron should maybe say why this was all happening, because it wasn't just the Shankill, it was, cross inner Belfast.
I mean, at some level, what was happening in Shankill was happening across the whole of Great Britain, because you're dealing again with an area where the prime industries have disappeared, which was, and so whether you were talking about Glasgow, whether you were talking about Newcastle, wherever, part of the same things were actually happening. The world was actually rapidly changing. In particular, in Belfast, what you actually had was a very decentralised system in which local government and areas below that held a lot of power, and that was in a sense, but part of the Orange Order held their power, and part of it was, as Jackie was saying, about the Protestant working class had just that bit more than the Catholic working class, and that was always something that they held on to. But what then happened, and what part of the struggle was in Northern Ireland, was as the shipyards collapsed, the linen industries collapsed, new capital came in. New capital, there was no land within the city centre. They went out to Craigavon, places like that, and so people they needed the skilled workers to move. So one thing was there was a drive to take people out of the Shankill to provide jobs for modern industry, but also what was also happening was that that came up in the film was about the landlord. That a lot of Shankill was owned by small landlords, and it was no longer profitable for them. So in a sense, what you had was a collapse in the profitability of the Shankill as an area, and at the same time you had wider forces happening.
Yeah. So those big things were happening in every industrial city in the UK. It wasn't just Belfast. And what was happening on the Shankill wasn't just happening on the Shankill in Belfast, it was happening in other working class communities in the inner city. But there were other dynamics at work, and this, you sort of referred to things that come in from the side. You know, the Troubles created a massive movement of population. And the massive movement of population meant that Catholics were moving a massive shift of population back into West Belfast from places like Rathcoole and other outlying areas. You had that move in, leaving vacant houses in those outlying estates. People in desperation to get out of the sort of awfulness that you saw in the film had no choice, because the houses weren't getting built fast enough in the Shankill, but to move. So the dynamic in the Shankill was different to nationalist West Belfast, for example, in that whole housing thing, and we could talk about a lot of that in detail. The Troubles were at their peak. The Shankill, not in its own, but was at the heart of those Troubles. You know, it had Troubles delivered to it, and it delivered Troubles to other places. There is little doubt, and we had some information, but the evidence on the ground seemed to show, and it was quite clear that, and I remember one occasion being in the Belfast Development Office, which was then in Adelaide Street, and this must have been 1977, with the Save the Shankill campaign, and the then heads of the Belfast Development Office saying to us on the way out, "You're talking to the wrong people here. You should be talking to the military in Lisburn." It was Lisburn headquarters, because that's where the plans are lying at the minute. So I've no doubt that at some point, you know, this got enmeshed, and you can imagine it would be strange if it didn't, the way this country was being run at the time. enmeshed in some sort of security thinking about, wouldn't it be a good idea, it would take a thorn out of her flesh if, and the Shankill was half gone then anyway, you know, if we finished the job off. I think that may have been the case at one point. Here's something that's absolutely critical. You mentioned the Shankill originally as the road to Antrim, when it was just fields, right, with a few houses and a church at the top of the road where the graveyard is, and a graveyard there. What became the Shankill had a function then. It had the function as a road to Antrim. It was useful. It had a purpose. In other people's heads, it had a purpose. Whenever the Shankill was built as we knew it, before redevelopment, as an industrial working class community, Ron alluded to this, it wasn't built by accident. It was built to serve the purposes of the linen mills. In fact, the houses were built by what were called the linen lords. So you worked in the mills from you were, well, back in the day, part-time from you were 12, full-time from you were 14. You got your pay at the end of the week, and then you paid it back to the linen lords that owned your houses. Now, that is how this system worked. The Shankill had a purpose, to serve the needs of industry. Why was the Shankill always not a community that was doing well educationally? This isn't a new thing. Go back to the 1950s and somebody count how many kids in the Shankill passed the 11 plus. I think it was Robert McCartney. So it was in the interest, they didn't need people educated. In fact, they didn't want them educated because they wouldn't have been working in the bloody mills anymore if they'd been educated. So people needed to be kept uneducated, no qualifications. There was another factor. During that whole period, I talked about 1922, if you were 50 years ago now, and 72, 50 years, you were in between two world wars. The country needed people to fight. So the Shankill had a reason for being, which was to make sure the shipyard worked, to make sure the linen mills worked and all of that. Whenever all of that was taken away, the economic side of it was taken away. And whenever the economic side needed to, people moved, as Ron said, from the Shankill to Craigavon and to Antrim, which was created as a growth town, then the Shankill lost its use, its value to society. And that becomes a big, big feature, I believe, and this is a deep thing. As a community, the purpose for which we were existed, which was given to us to become an industrial community, was no longer a purpose. There was no reason any longer in the people that controlled the whole thing, not just the planners, but the government, which was supposedly our own government by the time was an unionist government, and the Belfast Corporation was run by the Unionist Party. We no longer, as a community, had a purpose. And actually, when you think deeply about it, I know we're going to talk about derelict sites, there's something deeper than that. What's the purpose of this community? Because we don't serve a purpose any longer for government. We don't supply industry. The way wars are fought now, it's not a mass recruitment. So we have to reinvent the reason for being. And I think that's what we've been trying to do over the last number of decades. And the interesting thing, and I'll finish with, Billy, when people were calling out the things about the Shankill, in the past, nobody mentioned the word education. Nobody mentioned the word health, except Ron said he sometimes used it as a cover for getting some return from the housing executive or whatever. Things now that you realise are important. Back in 1972, 50 years ago, if you got to school through the rats and through all the burnings that were going on and through the bulldozer that was coming down your street while you were trying to get out to get the bus to school or to walk to school, because in those days you had Somerdale, Everton, Ballygamartin and Glencairn girls' schools, so you were walking there. If you got to school, that was an achievement. So those were not issues, and as Ron said, the big issue that you could not avoid was housing back then. That was, what people lived there. I look back at Buzz Logan's book of photos in the mid-70s and stuff and go, did we actually live through that? you know, and survive. So I think, you know, it's interesting that you know, the Shankill always had a purpose until suddenly it was no use to those that run the country anymore.
I suppose it's just like the finish. What would you say to yourself, Ron, that you know now, and I lost this to Jackie as well, in 1973? What advice would you give yourself then that you know now, in terms of what you were trying to do in your work? And I'd ask you to finish that too as well, Jackie.
Very little different than what we did. I think that you know we set up the groundwork for action to happen. I think some of the things that we didn't talk about as much as we could have was things like education and health, and I think probably picking up from what Jackie said, it's kind of like, what new identity does the Shankill need? And that was myself walking around. I started walking around town last night, thinking, here's the town centre. What role does an area like the Shankill play now? And if it doesn't have a role in the wider Belfast, Northern Ireland thing, what is it? What is the future that it has, which can give it some sense of an identity?
Yeah. The interesting thing about what we were doing back there then was actually, in a weird way, conservative. We were wanting to conserve what had existed that was working to a level. Now, everybody talks about the good old days, but a few people mentioned back in the day poverty, you know, and look at that video and tell me that was the good old days. But what we did have then was community, an amazing sense of community. And we still have that. And here's the problem. When you're into conserving or defending something, you can only, even when you're successful to a degree, you feel you've lost, because you'll never keep everything as it is. You know, somebody said, if you want nothing to change, you need to change. Yeah. And, you know, the Save the Shankill campaign, and I'll finish with this, had 4 very simple objectives. No more flats. Going to stop the flats, and it did. Percy Street was the first one. The Shankill Road itself, all the shops were to be knocked down, and there was to be a big district centre at Agnes Street built for shopping, which would never have happened, but all the shops were demolished. Now, everybody goes, the Shankill's not what it was. It's still there, you know, but because you were into conserving it, you could only lose. You felt you were losing. But you show me another working class area in Belfast that has still got what we've got on the Shankill. Sandy Row hasn't got it. Newtonards Road definitely hasn't got it, and you know, so that's the issue. And the other thing that it wanted to do, well, there was the thing about the Belfast Urban Motorway, and it was to be elevated. That's why the flats were built, the Weetabix flats, because it was going to be up in the air, and it ended up being the West Link down, you know. And the other bit was the Upper Shankill, what became known as Mid Shankill by the planners. And they wanted to extend the redevelopment line. And you asked me about the plot for the Shankill. By 1977, as well as not finishing off the redevelopment area that existed, which was up to then Crimea Street on the other side and Canmore Street on this side, as well as there being large areas of that not completed on either side of Agnes Street and down here behind Argyll, they wanted then to extend redevelopment in 1977 up to Tennant Street and the whole way up to Lanark, what became Lanark Way. And the idea was that by redeveloping that, they would fill the gaps that they had left in the old redevelopment area, and then you would have what the planners, and this was a document we did get that was never published, called White Lands. They actually called it White Lands that they were going to leave. And what Bill's doing at the minute's picking up on the legacy of that. Now then it was massive acres of land. And what we had to do was to get into negotiation about that, because the lesson I had, and it's the lesson The lesson of the Save the Shankill campaign is that if you're strong enough, you can stop things happening. It is a totally different matter, and this is a challenge, making things happen. You can only make things happen if you are in partnership with those who have the money. You know, whether that's, you know, private sector called developers, or whether that's government departments that have the money, though they don't have much at the minute. And that's where the notion of partnership with a small p comes in, you know, because we cannot regenerate ourselves on our own. And the lessons of this, we would never have started this without somebody like Ron Wiener being there for 3 years and laying the foundation of what could be picked up on by the community, which was outside help, you know. And it's the same, Billy, with stuff from Queens and other places. We can't do this on our own, but, you know, I think that's important. I don't think we would do an awful lot different, as Ron said, because even though now, like my own, you know, we need to deal with education, we need to deal with health issues, we need to deal with the housing issues and the derelict land and so forth. You couldn't have got at those issues then. There was only one issue, and that it was an issue of survival, and you had to fight to survive.
Thank you. Folks, I'm going to take, if anybody has a question or something that's really pressing. Ron, I'll go with yourself and then Pavel. We'll take a few questions, then we'll take
I just want to say, in terms of context, I mean, the plans for the Shankill were not exclusive to the Shankill in terms of their motorway and stuff. And I worked in the late 70s and early 80s and on the Falls Road, and as a community worker. And I recently looked at a video by the guy who designed Divis Flats, right? And this was at a stage where it became evident that flats weren't viable, but government hadn't accepted that. And he said, I have no regrets about my design, right? It was just the people in the flats didn't know how to live in them. And his plan, he said, in fact, I had a plan for 6 more of these. So the Falls Road would equally have been wiped out, except on an even bigger scale, where you would have had, you know, Divis Flats, which had 3,000 people. You had another 6 more of those going up, and the Falls Road would have been wiped. So this was not just here, and there's other places as well. And it's important. It was a general view to kind of essentially largely wipe out working class areas, move people out, and put big 3, 4 so circular inner, outer, middle motorways through. You know, and this would have been bad as it maybe turned out. And the Save the Shankill campaign and others actually did. The right did actually stop that. I mean, things could have been a hell of a lot worse.
Well, thank you for your fascinating talk you just gave us. I just wanted to ask two questions, and I have one comment. First of all, whenever I was writing in my thesis, I wouldn't be talking too long about what I do and all that, about the rape and plunder of the Shankill, and it's as an event, not the book, and its effects on the Shankill. My supervisor accused me of how you call it, just pursuing the golden age myth, or well, the myth of the good old times, as you said, and he pointed out that that actually the houses which were built and which replaced the houses which were demolished offered much better living conditions, because people had inside toilets, bathrooms, they had hot water, electric, and whatnot. And well, I just wonder, well, how would you comment on that? The other question is, if you could just, well, because I read the book quite a few years ago, I don't really remember. If you could just give me the dates when the Save the Shankill campaign started and when it finished, when, as Jackie said, the defense of the Shankill against, well, that disastrous redevelopment was concluded successfully. When do you think the moment came that the Shankill was effectively saved? Just said such a thing. What new identity does the Shankill need? Well, I would like to ask, does the Shankill need a new identity and a new purpose, you know, to exist. Isn't the purpose for it, you know, to exist is just to, you know, preserve its existence and survival? Because, well, as far as I understand, people like Jackie and many others who are in this, well, several others who are in this room, well, work tirelessly for several decades to preserve that community, and that's a good enough, you know, goal in itself. Now, well, please don't say, you know, I'm glorifying or romanticizing, you know, violence, but many people from this community gave their lives and freedom and were ready to do things to preserve that community as well. So, well, my question is, you know, isn't it a good enough, you know, goal in itself, preserving this community? I think it is.
Just on the factual things, so the Save the Shankill campaign was set up about 6 months after Ron left, and it was October 1974, 24th of October 1974. I'm saying that having a clue if it was 24th, but nobody can really contradict me, so. But it was October 1974. That it got set up. And one of the elements I mentioned actually about different elements in it, one of the elements then was it was chaired by somebody from the Ulster Workers' Council, because in May 1974 you had the Ulster Workers' Council strike, and you know it was a massive thing that I mean it was the last, in many ways it was the last big act that unionism and loyalism was capable of doing on a Northern Ireland-wide basis to change things. And, you know, a number of the organisers, the Ulster Workers' Council, would have come from the Shankill, and we got them on board. So you had like trade unionists that, you know, had been, you know, educated as trade unionists and stuff. It was a great thing. You see the preserving that you've mentioned, it's not enough. What needs to be, the Greater Shankill needs to be a great place to live in. The reason for its being is that it's a place where you have a quality of life that enables you to live your life and realise your dreams. So preserving it was actually what we needed to do in the 70s, because its very existence was under threat from various sources. I think now, and this is a harder job. It sounded awful back then, but it was easy stopping things happening that you didn't want to happen. Now, how we create a quality of life that people want, where they can realise their dreams, is actually, I think, the big challenge.
Jackie hit the nail on the head when he was speaking there earlier on. Well, people who can remember, go back, how long the Unionist Party controlled Northern Ireland. So it did, right? Now at the minute, we'll have no Stormont sitting, but when we go back, if they go back, it'll be Sinn Féin who'll be the biggest party. But what have we achieved in them years? Because we're control of education, we're control of housing, we're control of most of the things that went on. But it didn't improve in the Protestant areas, no way. That's why you have to give it. You go up to like an auntie, no disrespect to the people, no disrespect, whether they're Catholic or, you go up there and you look, you think you're in North Country when you see what has achieved around them areas. All right, they mentioned about you took a tour around Glenwood Street and Lumbrick Street, but them houses and them streets are bought houses. They're not social houses. They had to buy them houses to live there, so they had. From what I know, the housing executive don't build houses. Billy, maybe you could enlighten that on the Shankill anymore. It's houses sellers. But from what I hear, these plots of lands, that 80-odd plots of lands, they're looking hundreds and thousands of pounds, you know, for the sites, for they even start building on them. So where do we go from here, Jackie?
Listen, I understand what you're saying. There was a question about bathrooms and inside toilets and all. So those things are better. No, there's no doubt. Look at the video there. We're not living like that anymore. Now, there's unintended consequences which won't go into those sorts of things. You know, you have a big rise in asthma and a whole load of things like this. But nevertheless, things are better there. And you touched at the end on maybe where things are better. Let me tell you this: the boys' model, right, is bucking the trend across Northern Ireland of boys, Protestant boys, being educated, now achieving GCSEs, including English and Maths, grade C and above, and A levels. That's actually closing the gap. They're not just getting better, they're the only school that's closing the gap on the Northern Ireland average. Now, I'm only throwing that out there because I could talk about more. So we have a community, I think, where change is happening, and we need to be careful because it's a very tender plant that we're regrowing from within the reason for being, and you know, it could be destroyed very easily. I mean, we're very good at putting ourselves down, Billy, is all I'm saying.
Can I say something here? Because we have lost 30 years of regeneration. We are still living in slums. And the fact is, over the years, the thing has turned where the Protestants and the Catholics, we're the now ones being discriminated with housing. We are, and the challenge we have is with our statutory agencies and our politicians not supporting us. And what we need to do is, before we had a big part of the people were coming in from Dublin, banning all the properties up in inner Belfast. Now we have issues where we're sitting 7 years waiting on 12 social houses being built. They tell people there's no waiting list, but yet they say to the Protestant people, it'll be 10 years before this house is built in the rural park. What do people do when they're in housing crisis? They will go somewhere. So we're catch-22. We're sitting, waiting for social house to be built. We're being distracted and held back by statutory agencies. What we are asking for is, as part of the BUILD project, and we're challenging the actual housing executive on this, is around, you know, covenants around whenever we want, because we'll never get our social housing back because we don't have that population. Let's be realistic, it's never going to happen. So our only option is to look at affordable homes, and which obviously people now want to buy, and they want to have that pride in their community. But the fact is, we have to stand together and we have to challenge, because we had meetings there recently with Housing Executive high up and also our politicians, and they need to push that through.
I really am encouraged at people's sort of enthusiasm to continue the discussion about the 70s, and I know we've come up to the sort of current. What I'm going to propose is we take a wee very quick comfort break. Here's what we want to do. It's all very well to look in the past and you learn from the past, and it's so relevant. The amount of things that you see in 50 years ago, that in this campaign you see similarities. You know, when communities say something that's not taken seriously, say if a Shankill campaign got people who come in and were from academia and said that, and somehow it's sort of seen as different. So we do need to collaborate. We do need to open up. And we can't have this. We're not going to get 75,000 people who used to live in the Shankill coming back in with a new community, but we want people to be invested in, and we want people to feel that they've been listened to. As a result of the chaos we have over the last 50 years, even the last 25 years, because peace really didn't bring us a complete absence of violence. We know that. But actually, what it did do is we had to draw within. And yes, there are huge problems there, but I would say that the Shankill, and this isn't just me, it's proven, there's research done, in response to the chaos that we dealt with that affected our everyday lives, there was projects from early years programs to thinking around youth work facilities to look at actually non-violent responses to the legacy of the violence that were grassroots. Didn't take experts for people to come in and tell us how to do it. We had conversations and we come up with many solutions. And I think that's where we're at now. You know, the depopulation of Shankill is at zero sum. It's that continuous self-fulfilling prophecy. But we need a range of solutions. And the only way we can do that is not on our own, but reaching out to people. And that's what I think what the BUILD's done. We realise that it isn't all about the housing executive delivering. They'll never deliver, never wanted to deliver, and never will deliver. It's about us looking at the whole range of options that we have and getting organised.
We had a lot of discussion about what has happened in the past, the context, and why we're here. And one of the things that came out, that all that energy did have an effect in stopping a lot of the worst effects of this. As I think, as Jack and other actually making things happen is another story. And this bit I want to actually to ask Ian and Billy in particular, and if Ron wants to come on these stage, because there have been things happening, and I mean, more needs to happen, but we should be aware that things are happening. And I came back here after a 25-year break, and one of the things that impressed me is that the amount of community organisations and the amount of really good stuff happening here. I don't think a lot of people in the area maybe fully understand that, and certainly people don't from the outside. So we're going to start. I'd like to start maybe with Ian, and Ian maybe picks up the story, I mean, a decade or two later, in terms of what he and other people were trying to do, particularly in the Lower Shankill. And the Lower Shankill was the area which was most devastated by all the things we were talking about. So Ian, would you like to?
Yeah. Hi everybody. I don't know which hat I'm wearing today because I'm usually about 40, so I don't know whether I'm here as an elected councillor, community activist, or community worker. But we'll start off with community activist because I like that one. It gives me an opportunity to argue with people more. My introduction to Lower Shankill as a community worker goes as far back as 2009. The first thing that I noticed taking up a role were the number of green fields inside Lower Shankill. And when I started to inquire about why have we got so much greenery when other areas of Belfast are crying out for stuff, it was only then that I began to learn the history of the Rape and Plunder of the Shankill, all the stories about redevelopment, and the fact that some of the fields had been left as a field for upwards of 27 plus years. So my introduction to community activism started around the removal of so-called contentious paramilitary murals from walls. And community activism came into play for me whenever, as part of the studies we had to do, we asked community members if a particular mural was removed, what would you like to see it replaced with? And the answer from many people was a simple one. Why are you asking me this? Nobody asked me before. They just came and did it. And I very quickly learned that that was the same principle applied when it came to regeneration activity in that community, because working with colleagues from the Department for Communities, or DSD as it was then, I found out that Lower Shankill was the subject of numerous government master plans, 2002, 2005, 2007, 2009 and 2012. And the common factor across all of those government plans was there had been nothing done. Not one brick had been put in the ground as a result of government master plans. Why? Because the community weren't asked their opinion. So we launched ourselves into regeneration, beginning the conversation to ask government why we have so many fields, why we can't have regeneration. And as an individual from an organisation asking the questions, the answers that I got weren't very satisfying whatsoever. I was able to energise and mobilise people to start a campaign for regeneration in that community, which culminated in 2012. It coincided actually with Red Nose Day. So we had a presentation of a government master plan in a community centre in Lower Shankill. And over 100 people in the room, residents, all turned up and wore red noses on Red Nose Day, while the government official sat and told us how he intended to regenerate our community everybody, and it was so comical, but very, very powerful, that everybody produced a red nose and stuck it on, and just sat, basically told the government, you're clowns and you haven't done anything for us. So, community campaign began. We brought the Department for Communities and others to the table, and we set about a regeneration plan for our community. Government offered to build more houses than they did, first off, and as a community we refused the offer of more houses, and government couldn't understand why did we refuse more properties. And the answer to us was very simple, because the centre of the estate was derelict, and at that time there were 4 main thoroughfares by which you could enter or leave the community, and we insisted that the first phase of new housing was built in the very heart of the community, so that no matter how you entered that community, the first thing that you saw was a new development, not dereliction. And that was very important for us to do that. That enthused people, community activism, it motivated more people. We worked very closely with Jackie on a campaign to save our primary school, which under Jackie's stewardship was very, very successful. So for me, community activism is pivotal when it comes to moving forward. We helped save our school, we helped create relationships with the police and other government bodies that genuinely didn't exist. We got to a point whereby government introduced a scheme called Building Successful Communities, whereby the community sat with government, made plans for new social housing in the estate. 18 units were subsequently delivered in 2021. And phase 2 of that is another 28 units, which we have managed to put in the programme to build for year 24-25. And it only came about not because government came in and said to us, okay, what is it you want? We're going to help you out. It happened because the community came together and said enough's enough. The slogan we used for regeneration then is a slogan we use today. And we borrowed it from our neighbours in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, where the American government spent billions of dollars to regenerate the tourism heart of the city, but left the population wallowing in destruction on the edges of the city. And they came up with a very simple statement, and it was, nothing about us without us is for us. And when government asked us what we meant, it's really a simple thing for us. And it is ethos, and we base everything that we do on that principle. Please don't regenerate to us, come and regenerate with us. You know, high-level plans and community aspirations always meet in the centre ground, and that's where you can make real progress with government. The beauty of the Greater Shankill area, working with Billy and other colleagues, Stacey on BUILD, regeneration work spawned other work in this community. We had a lot of internal relationships to mend after internal feuding in 2000 and 2002. And for me, we have reached a point today where I am as confident and as passionate when I fight for regeneration for Glencairn as I am for Lower Shankill, for Lower Old Park as I am for Lanark Way. There is no area within the Greater Shankill that we cannot come together and help make a change. And for me, that's my driver. And the BUILD programme, for me, does that. You know, for a community which has, as Jackie alluded to, yes, there were bad things happened to this community, and there were bad things emanated from this community. We're not in denial of that. But we deserve proper regeneration activity in our community as part of a peace process that we all signed up to in 1998. The American government at that time promised the people of Northern Ireland that they would walk the journey with us towards peace and prosperity. Now, we all have a relative peace, we all enjoy that, but for the life of me, I can't find where the prosperity is in many working class areas because it isn't there. And we collectively need to fight for that. And positive regeneration activity, not just houses, you know, better educational facilities, better youth facilities, more industrial units is what makes a successful community. And we all have a role to play in it. Thank you.
I'd just like to quickly come on to Billy, and the BUILD organisation. BUILD actually stands for Better Understanding and Local Development. So Billy, how did that come about in terms of the connection? You can see the connections to what happened in the 70s and where you see it going.
Well, BUILD came as an organic sort of process, I suppose. And people might say, you know, well, you run a restorative justice project. What's regeneration? What are you doing there? And I suppose looking at the dereliction and looking at the sites every day, we did become normalised to it. And you start not to notice it, even though it's everywhere. But for me, as a restorative justice project, and I'm not going to go into too much detail into the board and around that, but the theory of restorative justice is where a human individual, where there's been damage done to that individual, we provide an opportunity for those who do the harm and those that are harmed by that event to come together, to give that person who's harmed a voice, and to try and get accountability for those who caused the harm. And you can see that poster there where it says 82 sites of dereliction is a dereliction duty. They're the physical scars that our community has faced. So as a restorative justice practitioner, for me, this is about looking at restorative justice at a community and societal level. We need to understand why our communities are physically scarred, and we need to articulate what it is that we need to move on from that. And having some sense of rates or approach to that or reconciliation for that is part of that journey. So we started from a community safety point of view. Derelict sites, you don't have to be a criminologist. It causes neglect, it causes blight, dumping, kids start lighting fires. There's no coincidence that they're tended to be around where interface areas were, so they provide a good opportunity to launch attacks on each other's communities. And therefore, we started to look and say, well, okay, what can we do in the short term? It started with a very, very small project, no money whatsoever. And we started, coming out of COVID, by the way, this was after the communities had stepped in, when again, many of the statutory agencies disappeared. And again, I think that's what we continually need to realise. The solutions are within our community. Nobody's going to parachute in to help us. Nobody's going to parachute in and give us the solutions and give us all the answers. We have them here. It's just collaborating with the right people, asking the right questions and understanding. So what we did was we got a group of people together and we said, right, okay, let's map these out. And we mapped them out. It equated to 82. And again, one of the principles of the BUILD project is involve, inform and improve. But we involve people in that process. Community development principles, get off our arses and do it. You're saying there's derelict sites, well, okay, it's all very well, we know that, what do we do? So we looked into the issue of why they were there, we looked into mapping the ownership, and then we started to look at what are some of the reasons why they're here. Let's start to understand that. And again, collaboration across the community. I'm no expert in regeneration, I run a restorative justice project, but I know that there are some people, and thankfully, there are people who were in our community who were doing it maybe in isolated neighbourhoods for decades. So we brought them together into a working group. And that working group for 6 months worked every fortnight, met every fortnight, pulled information together, created data, looked at policy, and didn't start just gurning and jump up and scream and say, look at the state of this place, we want you to do something. We got people mobilised. we got people to think about, to start to ask for more. That actually, why 25 years on is it? But it's not good enough just to get people angry. You have to give them a plan, and that's what we try to do. I remember the community conventions that we've done, and we've said earlier, this community is gifted with the projects we have, and we don't realise. I know life's hard, but hell, it would be a hell of a lot harder if we didn't have the activism in the projects dealing with making better quality of life. But the physical state of the Shankill is, nobody can deny it, it needs addressed. But what we did then was we pulled people together and we started to look at that, what can be done in a practical sense. And then we brought statutory agencies in. And then we started to look at, let's start to be ambitious. And I have to say, it developed into something that was massive. It was a very quick learning curve, and we brought people across all the different areas of Shankill, because this dereliction, and it isn't just about sites, it's about the sense of people feeling heard. You look at the Rape and Plunder of the Shankill, you read the books, it's the same recurring issue. It's people telling us that accept what you get and shut up. And again, I think the only way we're going to work ourselves out of this is actually having a plan. The community convention had this thing, if we don't have a plan, or if you don't have a plan, you're part of someone else's plan. And that's what I think, you know, the Save a Shankill campaign stopped the obliteration of this community. Now, for 25 years from the peace process, we've been able to build social regeneration, but we're always knocked off the kilt with all these things that come downstream. Widespread violence still occurs. So how do you think of blue sky? How do you think about a new way of life when there's still that constant destabilisation of widespread conflict? But for the first time in a long, long while, I think is now the time that we have a chance to actually seize it. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be very difficult. And I have to say, I'm very, very frustrated, because the fundamental self-fulfilling prophecy we have is that for whatever reason, whether it was by just some number of, as Jackie calls it, the perfect storm of deindustrialisation, people moving, this community had 2/3 of its population moved out. Thankfully, because we've brought in collaboration, we've looked at analysis through Queen's University, similar to what the BUILD Shankill, or the Save a Shankill campaign did, bringing people in, not only to actually say, not that we couldn't do it ourselves, but when other people are saying it, gives our voice stronger, it gives it some status. And that's saying that the Shankill for the first time in generations is now, hasn't went into decline. And in fact, not only has the population not went into decline, it actually has we were left with an older, vulnerable generation, because all the people with skills were moved out. It's actually new. The age profile is changing as well. And that's because of the work that was done at grassroots, trying to improve the quality of life. Now it's about improving the physical space. What I feel frustrated is we're caught in this catch-22, where statutory agencies continue to say, we've allowed the communities to die, we've allowed them to become, obviously, sink estates, and then they wonder why people aren't on waiting lists for social housing in areas that have been completely de-infested. Glencairn has no physical shop. 2023 and people are living in Glencairn. We've seen the squalor, but just because it's a lot better doesn't mean that there's appropriate services, and people should have the right to benefit from the peace dividend. It isn't just about, you know, this vision for the new agenda for Belfast that is about the city centre. Ian and I went on to an initiative that they're doing. It's a global tourist initiative, and you'll probably have heard of it, Belfast Stories. North Street. Well, it's exactly 500 metres, because we have mapped out and measured every site there is, from the first derelict site of 82 of them on the Shankill Road. £120 million investment that's going to attract tourists from all over the globe. And that's great for the city centre. But is it going to make a difference to people 500 metres up a street? And that's what we need to do. We need to make sure that our voices are being heard. It is difficult, because you're constantly against that. Here's the zero-sum mindset. Here's the self-fulfilling prophecy. Here's the policy we can't do. But we've proven that there's things that can be done with imagination. We've looked at this. This isn't just about housing, although it's central. We need to get people in this community. It's about creating a sense of place. It's about place shaping. That's why Argyll is looking about building and making a success for economic growth, for small business, small startup. That's why we have artists who are sitting in the Shankill Mission, because the arts can create the circumstances. That's why we're trying to create a place that actually, and we're going to finish with a video because we can harp on all day. It's about changing the narrative, because when we actually challenge the narrative where people says, don't want to live here, we went directly to developers and said, we've sold houses. People do. In fact, we mapped it out. There's at least 25 private developments that are all successful in some of the areas that you would never dream of. So it can be done with the right intention and the right thing. Unintended consequences are one thing, but I just see too many intentional consequences. I see people who, the only other decision you can make is that they intend to allow this to happen, because maybe it isn't that we're part of their dream or their vision, or maybe we aren't relevant to what their new skill set is. But the people in this room will make sure they will, and it takes time, it takes effort, but it's a collective approach. It's about looking at the practical things on a site-by-site basis, but it's also in 2 years we have looked at informing ourselves of how the systems work. And when you understand some of the systems, you suddenly ask these questions, well, why? And if it's not the right answer, then we have to go and find the answer. And if we come up and we've brought people from different backgrounds into the build process that are from business, because there was a thing, we looked at different success stories and we looked at good practice and all this. We've done stuff, a lot of stuff simultaneously. But one of the things that stuck with me very, very early on in the process was somebody said, it's all very well to have mother superiors. And what they mean by that is the people who care for the people. But you need the Richard Bransons alongside you. Because in this difficult circumstances where it's so easy just to do nothing or let the market take care of it, and it's a complete market failure, you need people coming around a table with us, and we have done that more recently. We've established a Shankill Housing and Enterprise Group that has people with business acumen, people with different skill sets, sitting down with community representatives to say, if this is a vehicle that we can drive something, then it's worth it. And I think, you know, when you look at, we're now working with a different environment. I was in the markets, sir, for the first time in 52 years of my life, walking around the markets. Why? Because of a similar experience. They have a similar challenge happening over there. And if we can learn and we can share things that we can learn, and we have learned with them on other things, and vice versa, well, that's what we do. Because again, we ain't going to do it on our own, but at the same time, we need to not rely on people coming and giving us the answers. So for me, folks, there's so many different things we're trying to do. We've looked at new energies, we've looked at new approaches, we've talked about, in an area that has such socioeconomic challenges, imagine if we created new homes that actually took away the bills for heat and electricity. And for want of a better word to use upon, we were trying to green the Shankill. You know, when you look at maps and people are fearful of greening the Shankill, we want to green it in a new urban, new energy way, and try something different. And why shouldn't we? Because if we don't, it's not going to happen, folks. So it's like, get up and do it.
It's been fascinating this morning. Thank you very much, everybody, for your contributions. Yeah, I'm Una Somerville. I'm a planner, and I don't all shoot me. And I was very fortunate to work with Jackie and Rowan and others in the late 80s, early 90s, producing the Greater Shankill strategy with my colleague Peter Fleming from BDP. So I have a great fondness for this area, but the fascinating thing is it's rare that you get an insight over such a long period of time for one area, and I think it's fascinating to hear yourself, Ron, speak, and Jackie always. But I suppose my question really, or comment is, if you can't do it yourselves and you're realising that, and you know, and you've done the things that you would You know, you've said, I think people have said you would do the things again in the way you did them, that your activism and all the rest. But the key seems to be the partnership and the collaboration. How do you get access to those people that can help you do what you need to do and what you want to do? So it's a question of how do you build the access, how do you get the partnership, who speaks to who, how do you actually achieve that?
Well, I think you start by having a structure, what we've tried to do, where we've brought people in with different skill sets, different ideas. We've looked at what are the problems, and we've come up with some of the solutions. We've engaged all different sectors, because, as I say, this isn't just about housing, and it isn't just about social housing. It's about private, it's about rental, it's about changing markets. We have looked and went, and I suppose one of the things that I naively thought was that we would do all this work, and then people would say, that's a great job, thanks, we'll take it from here, guys. It isn't going to happen. It's a longer war, we know that. And the problem is that you do need people with different insights, and that's why this partnership, I think, is one of the unique things. And maybe during the 70s, you couldn't have attracted a private investor in. You couldn't. You had to rely on. Now, and this is what you'll see in the video, we're trying to pitch this Shankill as an area that's open. Despite what the media says, there's a hell of a lot going for here. Any other piece of real estate anywhere in Western Europe would be snatched up. Now, the problem is we want development, but we don't want development as for the needs of investors and just their finances. We want development that's been set and worked out, that we know. And again, they knew it in the 1970s. They knew that they didn't want flats. They knew they wanted terrace. They come up and they were able to do it. I think we can do it again. It's just going to take, it's trying to change that mindset. My argument is, if you're solely from the statutory point of view saying that there's nothing we can do because there isn't a need for housing, and we've seen all the reason why there's no need for people to rush in here, then what do? It's a market failure. It's down to those in responsibility to help the community intervene. And what we have done with Queen's is we've realised that there's different approaches and different strategies needed in different parts of the Shankill. There's different things that'll come that could be threats. There's different things that are opportunities. But actually starting to say that the Shankill's open for business and try and pitch it in a positive agenda, because that, for me, is what BUILD's important point is. It isn't about gurning and saying everybody do it for us. It's about saying we do have some ideas. Now, we could probably take them a lot further with more resources, and that's where I think we're at this crux. We should have, and I would like to have got there sooner, but it is D-Day. It is a time now to say we have done as much as we possibly can at this level. We've looked at investments, we've looked at proposals in a very difficult market, but we think that there's opportunities here, and I also believe that positivity is a catalyst that creates other things. If something happens, it creates that dynamo that other people want to be part of it, and that's what we're hoping.
That's it.
One of the issues around access, it is a very interesting point, funny enough. But the partnership working that we undertook with Queen's University was very important to us, because very often in the past, when communities produced the results of community surveys, for want of a better word, they were very often dismissed by your peers that said, oh, well, sure, you would say that. There was a degree of legitimacy came to BUILD because the information which BUILD collated and presented to Queen's University, Brendan Murtagh basically told us that a government department would pay £100,000 for a consultant to bring together this information, and the community brought that information together. So our information was verified and almost legitimised by Queen's University, which meant that it couldn't be dismissed out of hand. That's one access. The other access point came, and Billy used this terminology very often and very well, was when you engage with departmental officials to a certain level, whenever you came to the business end of a meeting, very often you were told, oh, that's way above my pay grade. But we started to ask the question, well then, bring the person on the right pay grade into the room. And using other access with Terence and the She group, that access, it becomes harder now for people to close the doors in your face, because there is altogether a legitimacy about the entire programme. It's not just a gang of community activists complaining that them ones get everything and we get nothing. On the contrary, it's about people with a genuine willingness to improve the built fabric of the Greater Shankill, but also the social fabric within the Greater Shankill. And when those two meet, it's just so much harder to dismiss, you know.
And thanks for everybody for their contribution. So who am I? I'm Terence Brannigan. I'm not from the Shankill, but I'm from a working class community. I was born in Lower North Belfast. We were evicted from there because we couldn't pay the rent. Ended up in East Belfast. We were evicted from there because we couldn't pay the rent. I lived in East Belfast right at the height of the riots that we talked about earlier, so had the same kinds of experiences that Jackie talked about. I went through the same kind of life. My father was a trade union activist and was sacked for it. Whilst I'm not from here, the stories are parallel. Those communities that I lived in and came from and ended up in South Belfast, and a repeat of the story, so we kind of went on repeat, and understand the frustrations that exist within this community. Why? Because these communities, and communities like Shankill, are marginalised, demonised, and you ask, who's representing our view? Who's representing the working class view onto power and onto people who make these decisions? So who represents us? Who voices our concerns? Who makes demands on our behalf? The people who can, who have the power and who have the money. So you can sit and complain and shout, and you have a right to, but it is about activism. And two great things I took from what you said, Jackie, and I purposely noted it down. So the first thing is stop what you don't want happening, what this community does not want happening. So how do you do that? You organise. So you organise and stop. And then the second thing you said, when I wrote it down, was then what you do is partner with the people who have the money to get the investment. And I don't care whether it comes from the public sector or the private sector. I don't care where the money comes from, but we then get the investment. So we partner with those people and make it in their best interest to invest, to bring their money to bear on this place, to make the change that the people here have a right to demand. So that thing of organise and stop and then partner and invest, that community activism is absolutely at the core. Billy said earlier, and again I wrote it down, if you don't have a plan, you're part of someone else's plan. And that's what's happened time after time after time in our working class areas. That they have come up with a grand plan, and then another grand plan, you're pointing, and then another grand plan. And because we haven't had a plan, then we have not been in control. So it's been referred to, Ian and Billy and Ron and myself and people from the private sector have gotten together to start to try to create a plan. So this community's plan, not someone else's plan, so this community's plan. And then it was very important what was said a moment ago. So how can you grab the attention of those who make the decisions? Well, it is bringing together those people who do have connections and do have influence and do have access. So bringing them into the tent, not outside the tent. And that is, as I say, from the private sector, from the public sector, and from this community, importantly. And when we start to put a plan together, asking questions and listening, that's why I'm here, was to listen and take notes and try to understand, so that whatever plan we come up with does reflect what people want here. And when starting to put that plan together, it's keeping coming back to the community and says, is this what you mean? No, it isn't. Okay, explain to me. Then change the plan, so that finally you come up with a plan that actually is right for this community and the people within it, to bring back the vibrancy that existed before. And Pavel said earlier, you know, what's the purpose? And there can be a number of purposes, but the key purpose is to regenerate the community. And I don't mean just the physical part of the community, I mean the heart of the community. So regenerate the community is in itself a great purpose. And there could be other things that you do, whether it's regenerating housing, whether it's regenerating business, whether it's regenerating green space, whether it's creating tourism and the arts. Those are all good purposes within that, but at the heart of it, it is about regenerating and revitalising this community. So what we're trying to do is start that process of organise and stop, and now we are getting to the people who make the decisions, because we have people involved who have influence and have access. It's absolutely key, because if you don't have those things, then you're talking to yourself, you're howling at the moon. And already we're starting to, we've mapped out the stakeholders and already we're having conversations with them. So those people who own the sites, and they're departments from government, so it is City Hall, it is Department for Communities, it is Northern Ireland Housing Executive, and we know there are sites from the private sector, and we're starting to have the conversations with them as well. So go to the people who have hold of the, what is essentially community asset, but they have a hold of it. And then it's having the conversations, creating the plan, making sure that the community are behind that plan. So it is that community activism again. So let's get a plan that stops, let's get people galvanized, that stops them doing what we don't want them to do. Then let's have a plan and access to money. So partner, as Jackie says, with people who've got the money, and then start to roll this out. It ain't going to be done in 2 weeks. It ain't going to be done in 2 years. But we can do it. You talked about phases, stroke phrases earlier on. It is that thing of we'll start to roll that out, a plan that this community wants to embrace itself. So this is the beginning of the journey. But I'm here to listen and then respond, because we have got people genuinely with influence and access on that body now. And importantly, what we're making sure that we're doing is legitimizing that organisation. And that is putting in the boring stuff like really good governance, because if you don't have it, you won't have any credibility with them. So play their game, leverage their rules in order to take advantage. That's what we're trying to do.
At one level, it feels like history's repeated itself, but that's a positive thing. So it's not a negative thing, because the world is always changing, and you're always faced with new situations. So what's been so impressive is the fact that there's still a spirit there, which is about organising, about taking on the new situations, and about finding a way of, in a sense, preserving what's important from the past, but also taking into account the changes which are happening around us. And so, to me, it's been really reassuring in a way. So it's kind of like when I was walking around Belfast last night, and I was thinking, what's the purpose of the Shankill? And I think the purpose of the Shankill is the people within it, and the purpose is for them to retain what it is they want about their way of life. And the fact that it's actually happening it seems to me to be great. And so it's been really a privilege to be able to be here and hear it, and to be able to hear the work that people like yourselves are doing. And I was in another meeting earlier today where there were a lot more ideas being talked about social enterprises happening. And what was interesting almost, there's this new idea about the 15-minute city, that everybody should be able to live and work and have, and be cultural and entertain. And in some ways, the old Shankill had that in a way. And part of it seems to me, when people are talking about what they're putting into the Shankill now, is they're actually doing the same sort of thing now, where you're talking about being able to live there, but be able to have the shops there, to be able to have the businesses there that people can actually get to, so that the wealth that's being created gets spent within the community, so that the in a sense it becomes self-surviving, because what forces outside do is they come in, invest and take money out. And so what you want to do is have a system which actually keeps money in. So it's been great to listen to it, and thank you very much.
Okay. All I want to just thank a few people. Particularly thank Ron. I'm afraid I'm responsible. I got his number and phoned him up and twisted his arm to kind of come over here, which is no mean achievement. And I think it's given us unique insight. I'd like to thank Ian and Billy and Jackie, and I'd like to thank Glenn for the. Hopefully this will turn into a podcast, and in itself, this becomes another, on top of the videos we've got, this becomes quite a powerful piece, I think. I'd like to thank Sharon and the students from Artes. Ron will be doing a session with them tomorrow about them doing specific pieces of work in the area. And thank you, the rest of you, for coming.